So it's great to see you all. Thank you for turning out today. My talk will be drawn from some chapters in my 2010 book titled Getting It Wrong, 10 of the Greatest Misreported Stories in American Journalism. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to put in a shameless plug as well. My most recent book came out early this year, 1995, The Year the Future Began. Both books were published by the University of California Press. The 1995 book is dedicated to my wife, Anne-Marie Regan, who's sitting in the front row. Thank you, Anne-Marie. So, let's get going. What are we talking about here? What are media-driven myths? These are prominent stories about and or by the news media that are widely believed and often retold, but which, under scrutiny, under close inspection, dissolve as apocryphal or wildly exaggerated. Media-driven myths. And I'll be talking today about 3 prominent media myths. One of them has to do with the dominant narrative of the Watergate scandal. Another is about the Napalm girl photograph in Vietnam in 1972. And the third media myth that I'll discuss today is that associated with the radio dramatization of the War of the Worlds on the eve of Halloween in 1938. So let's get going. Watergate. No doubt, no myth that Richard Nixon resigned the presidency. He did indeed. He was the first and only president to resign the presidency. And 20 or so people associated with his administration or his re-election campaign went to jail for various crimes: obstruction of justice, perjury. Lots of people went to jail in the Watergate scandal. And obviously, as you may remember, to roll up a scandal of the dimension and the breadth and the depth, the extent of Watergate required the contributions of many agencies and entities: special prosecutors, federal judges, panels of both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, the FBI, the Justice Department, and on and on. Lots of actors combined collectively to ferret out the information that brought down Richard Nixon's corrupt presidency. But even then, even with an array of investigative entities, Nixon probably would have walked. He probably would have survived the scandal had it not been for the secret White House tapes that he made of many conversations inside the Oval Office with his top aides. Those tapes proved to be crucial in finding the evidence that led to Richard Nixon's resignation in August of 1974. Nonetheless, the enduring dominant narrative of Watergate has been that Nixon's presidency was brought down by the dogged reporting of 2 Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. That has become the narrative most people associate with the Watergate scandal. And the Post did have some notable stories in 1972, particularly the summer of 1972, in the immediate aftermath of the break-in at the Watergate complex in Washington, the seminal crime of the Watergate scandal. They identified the security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president, James McCord, as having been one of the Watergate burglars, one of the burglars arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate. That was a very important tie. They also linked donations made to Nixon's campaign, his re-election campaign, to the burglary. Another important connection. And they also tied the likes of John Mitchell to the operations against the Democrats. Important stories, but together, not enough to unseat an incumbent president. And it's important to recognize, too, that there were many important stories the Post did not break, did not disclose. These included the cover-up, the well-established cover-up of the crimes of Watergate. Nor did the Post disclose the hush money payments to Watergate burglars, an attempt to keep them silent about who was behind the burglary. And the Post did not break the story about the taping system, Nixon's taping system. That was disclosed during the Senate Select Committees on Watergate hearings in July of 1973. And nor did the Post disclose the smoking gun tape, the tape of a conversation a few days after the break-in at Watergate between Nixon and one of his top aides, H.R. Haldeman, in which Nixon approves a plan to divert the FBI's investigation away from Watergate. A clear, unequivocal case of obstruction of justice, and that tape came to be known as the smoking gun tape. That was not a Washington Post disclosure either. So you may ask, didn't the Post's reporting keep the story alive? Didn't it keep it going when a lot of people were ignoring it? Well, maybe, but the Post, especially in the summer of 1972, the Post wasn't alone. George McGovern, in his hapless campaign against Richard Nixon in 1972, he won one state in a Nixonian landslide, that state being Massachusetts. McGovern was out there accusing Nixon of Nazi-like tactics in the Watergate, linking him, without evidence, but linking him nonetheless, to the Watergate break-in. The Democrats also filed suit against the Committee to Re-elect the President to compel testimony by some of the CRP executives under oath. The General Accounting Office also investigated the Watergate break-in, and the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times also were in on the investigation. So the Post really wasn't terribly alone. And it's interesting, too, it is very interesting to note how principals at the Post over the years have poo-pooed the notion that it was the newspaper that brought down Richard Nixon. They have balked at embracing that interpretation. Katharine Graham, who was the publisher of the Post before, during, and immediately after the Watergate scandal, said in 1997, sometimes people accuse us of bringing down a president, which of course we didn't do. The processes that caused Nixon's resignation were constitutional. Ben Bradley, who was the executive editor during the Watergate period, it must be remembered, he said in 1997, it must be remembered that Nixon got Nixon. The Post didn't get Nixon.
That's a good one.
I like it too. Pithy, isn't it? The then ombudsman for the Washington Post, Michael Gettler, he wrote in a column in 2005 that ultimately it was not the Post, but the FBI, Congress, acting in bipartisan fashion, and the courts that brought down the Nixon administration. And if you like that earlier pithy quote, you might like this next one too. Maybe not. In earthier terms, Bob Woodward has said similarly, to say the press brought down Nixon, well, that's horse bleep. That is pithy, isn't it? But why then does this dominant narrative, the heroic journalist interpretation of Watergate, live on? If the Post is rejecting it, if it's pretty clear that it took a lot of entities and agencies combined to dynamite Nixon out of office, why does this heroic journalist narrative live on as the dominant narrative of Watergate? There are several reasons. One, it's an appealing shorthand for explaining the scandal. Yeah, it was these two young, dogged reporters to the Washington Post that exposed Nixon's presidency. It's a very appealing story. It's a nice storyline. And it's also an interpretation that avoids the complexities of Watergate. You know, who was Haldeman? Where did Ehrlichman fit in? And John Dean, who is he now? And how about this guy, Alexander Haig, what was his role? And John Mitchell? How about his wife? All these complexities of Watergate make it very, very difficult for people to keep straight who was whom. So the heroic journalist narrative makes it easy. Nixon was brought down through the work of these young, aggressive reporters. It's an interpretation that is appealing and avoids the complexities of Watergate while grasping the essence of the scandal, i.e. Nixon resigned because of his wrongdoing. A third reason why this dominant narrative lives on is that it is reassuring to journalists that they can make a difference. It is a media-centric interpretation, a media-centric interpretation. So where did this dominant narrative come from? What are the origins of the origins of the myth, the heroic journalist myth? There are at least three sources. One is the book that Woodward and Bernstein wrote about their Watergate reporting, called All the President's Men. It came out in 1974. Less than 2 years later, there was the cinematic treatment of All the President's Men, a critically well-received movie about the journalists and the end of the Nixon administration. And also, there was a 30-year-long guessing game about the identity of Woodward's super-secret source, codenamed Deep Throat. Let's take a look at each of these factors in turn. The book came out, it was exquisitely well-timed. It was published in June of 1974, 2 months before Richard Nixon's resignation. It came out just as the Watergate scandal was nearing its culmination. It came out in exquisitely great timing. It offered the public a journalist's brief for Watergate, how Watergate was uncovered. That was the storyline. That was the storyline. The book immediately shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there throughout the summer and well into the fall of 1974, during and after the resignation of Richard Nixon. It's there, it's at the top of the list, it's in the public focus. The movie came out in April of 1976, starring these guys in the roles of Woodward and Bernstein, Redford and Hoffman. It was a great movie. And it remains a great movie. It's still watchable. It didn't win the Oscar for the Best Picture of 1976. Anybody guess which movie did win the Oscar? Rocky was the winner. Rocky beat out All the President's Men as the Best Picture that year. Nonetheless, more people have seen the movie than have read the book, All the President's Men. It is still shown in some journalism classes, both at the college level as well as at high school and junior high level, as a primer on how to conduct investigative reporting, how to do it. More so than the book, the movie focuses exclusively on the exploits and the risks taken by the journalists, Woodward and Bernstein. This book, the movie version of the book, excludes all the other forces and factors, and in fact sort of denigrates their contributions, focusing exclusively on Woodward and Bernstein. Again, leading to this interpretation, leading to this notion that they were central, that they were crucial to bringing down Nixon's corrupt presidency. Both the book and the movie introduced to the public consciousness this shadowy, high-level government source named Deep Throat, codenamed Deep Throat. Took its name from a pornographic movie that was popular at the time. And Deep Throat was meant in the Washington Post newsroom to convey the fact that he was a super secret source whose identity could not be disclosed, but would speak to Woodward, occasionally in garage locations. There's, in fact, a garage over in the Roslyn section of Arlington where they did meet from time to time. And it's destined to be torn down, but that is another story. That he would speak with Woodward on deep background. Couldn't be quoted, couldn't even be paraphrased. he would give Woodward information that would keep the investigation on track. That was the understanding. Hence the name Deep Throat. Now, this became, the identity of Deep Throat was mentioned in, became a guessing game, a 30-year guessing game in Washington, D.C. And a city where the coin of the realm is exposing secrets, this was remarkable, that a prominent source, the identity of a prominent source was kept secret for 30 years. Almost unimaginable. Almost unimaginable. And it became a parlor game. Who was Deep Throat? Who was Deep Throat? And over the years, many candidates were advanced. Henry Kissinger, Patrick Gray, Diane Sawyer, who worked in Nixon's press office for a while, was thought to have been a candidate to be Deep Throat. John Dean, his lawyer, Pat Buchanan, Ron Ziegler, the White House press secretary. And also, common interpretation was that Woodward and Bernstein developed a composite drawing from different people, different sources, to put together this literary device, this Deep Throat. In fact, I believe that that was the case, because the identity was kept secret for so long that it had to be a composite. It had to be a literary device. But in 2005, Deep Throat, or his family, self-revealed him as W. Mark Felt, formerly the number 2 guy at the FBI. Now, Felt's name had been bandied about on many occasions as the most likely candidate to have been Deep Throat, but he often denied it. Said, you know, if I were Deep Throat, I would have done a better job at it. You know, and I hate newspapers, and I wasn't really interested in being Deep Throat at all. So he effectively parried the notion that he was Deep Throat. The guessing game kept Woodward and Bernstein and the Washington Post in the centerpiece, in the forefront of discussions about Watergate long after they otherwise would have been forgotten. So what do we conclude? This heroic journalist interpretation of Watergate is erroneous. That the contributions of Woodward and Bernstein to the overall trajectory of the story of uncovering the scandal were modest at best. And that other forces and factors mentioned earlier deserve credit, deserve recognition for having really unraveled the scandal. I think we should take Bob Woodward at his word. He said on an NPR program several years ago, the mythologizing of our role in Watergate has gone to the point of absurdity, where journalists write that I single-handedly brought down Richard Nixon. The Washington Post had some part in a chain of events that are described in our book that were part of a long and complicated process over many years. I think he's right. The mythologizing of their role in Watergate has reached the point of absurdity. I'd be happy to take a couple of questions or comments, or we could just move on if you'd like to do that. To the next one. Sir.
Isn't it possible, or my memory is, they sort of kept the attention of not just the public, but they kept the attention of people involved with an issue that would have been, for many, easier to turn away from rather than get involved in the maelstrom?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that there were lots of people looking at Watergate, and the thinking has become that, well, they kept the story alive. It was just the Washington Post. The Post was out there alone for the longest time. It's an intriguing story, it's an intriguing account, but it's not true. It's not true. Yes, ma'am.
But isn't it a but-for?
Meaning?
Meaning that may not have done the whole thing, and it may very well have fizzled out, but without that, none of it would have happened.
The investigations into the crimes of Watergate were well underway, and really didn't need the Washington Post to accelerate them. It was, in fact, in some respects, the authorities were annoyed that the Post was sort of breaking some of the stories, but they were not breaking the central stories in the scandal. One other question, and then we'll move on. Sir?
Well, the problem is they made a movie about it, and movies become the default history, the same way that the Imitation Game is going to become the default history of the German code-breaking effort.
I think you're right. You know, once Hollywood gets a hold of it, it's like, you know, it's prone susceptible to distortion. And it's really no way to regard or study or appreciate history.
Movies are not documentaries.
They are not. They are not. But a lot of people learn from the movies and think, oh, okay. Because it impresses in the mind's eye what must have happened.
Well, that's how future generations are going to learn their history.
Yeah.
From movies on Netflix.
All the President's Men is shown far more often in high school classrooms than the book is required reading. That's for sure. Let's move on to the myths of Napalm Girl. A dramatic photograph, in fact, one of the most iconic photos of the Vietnam War. Taken in June of 1972 near the village of Trang Bang in South Vietnam. And it showed the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of a errant South Vietnamese Air Force napalm strike on this village, which had been attacked by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces on June 8th of 1972. It was taken by an Associated Press photographer whose name is Nick Ut. He still is working for AP, now in Los Angeles, and often is photographing Hollywood-related events. But nonetheless, Nick Ut's photograph of Napalm Girl won a Pulitzer Prize in 1973. Its impact has been called immeasurable, and it is indicative, many people say, of the power of photojournalism, a power of an image to make a difference. It has been called by the editor, the AP photo editor, who handled and processed and made sure this photo made the wire. It's been called a photo that doesn't rest. A photo that doesn't rest. And it's also certainly ranks up there with other iconic, disturbing images from the Vietnam War, including Saigon execution during the Tet Offensive of 1968, and a Buddhist monk self-immolation in June of 1963. Over the years, though, there have been 4 media myths that have emerged about the Napalm Girl image. One was that the photograph hastened an end to the war in Vietnam, that it was so powerful and so evocative that it hastened an end to the Vietnam War. A related myth is that it galvanized public opinion, against the war. It turned American public opinion against the war. Another, perhaps smaller myth, is that it was on the front pages. This photograph was published on the front pages of newspapers across the United States. And finally, another myth was that the napalm was dropped by American warplanes. So let's take a look at each of these myths in turn, starting with the notion that it hastened an end to the war. You can look at this in 2 ways. One is that the war for the United States was already winding down. Almost all combat troops were out of Vietnam by the time this photograph was taken. And that it wasn't going to be very long before there was a breakthrough at the Paris peace talks in which the outline of a peace agreement that was signed the following year emerged. Another way to look at this is that, well, it couldn't have hastened an end to the war because the war really wasn't over until the North Vietnamese took over the South in April of 1975. In any case, it's impossible to say that the photograph hastened an end to the war. Well, what about then it had the effect of galvanizing public opinion against the war? Tempting, but not true. By then, by June of 1972, American public opinion had turned decisively against Vietnam, against the U.S. participation in the war. In fact, in early 1971, about a year and a half before the Napalm Girl photograph was taken, 60%, almost 60% of Americans responding to a Gallup survey said that it had been a mistake for the United States to send troops to Vietnam. This question by Gallup was asked often during and even after the war as kind of a marker for U.S. support, public opinion support for the war. As I say, early in 1971, it was clear that most Americans thought it had been a mistake to go to the war. Well then, wasn't this photograph so compelling that it made the front pages of newspapers across the country? It made the front pages of some US newspapers. A research assistant has done some intriguing research for me at the Library of Congress, examining 36 leading US metropolitan dailies, finding that 15 of them did not publish the photograph on the front page, and that 10 of them didn't publish this photograph at all. So no, most US newspapers did not, at least leading US metropolitan dailies, did not publish the photo on its front page. And the fact, or the notion that the napalm was dropped by US warplanes. It's a mistaken belief that persists. The New York Times, in an article about 3 years ago, said the photograph showed the aftermath of one of the thousands of bombings in the countryside by American planes. When this was called to their attention, you would think the Times would have corrected it in short order. A correction was in order? Not so, they said. They said its story referred only to American planes, that the plane had been built by an American manufacturer. The plane was a Douglas A-1 Skyraider, to be precise, and made as if the manufacturer of the aircraft had anything to do with the decision to drop napalm on Trang Bang village in June of '72. Evidence of the resistance and reluctance of newspapers to get it right, to issue corrections. So what accounts for the myths of the napalm girl? There are at least 3 factors. The image itself was so aesthetically powerful that it must have had powerful political policy effects. That's one reason. It also offers an easy, readily accessible explanation for complex events, i.e., what led to the US withdrawing its forces from Vietnam. In part, it was Nixon's Vietnamization policy. In part, it was public opinion. But it's far easier to say, oh, it was the napalm girl photo. It was so powerful that it hastened the US withdrawal from Vietnam. And it's also a ready way to assign guilt or responsibility, if indirectly, to the United States for what critics say was an immoral war. And this factor has been complicated by a false claim of responsibility that emerged about 25 years after the photograph was taken. A former US Army captain came forward to say, I was the pilot of that plane. Then when it was made clear to him that he couldn't have been the pilot, he said, well, I ordered up the attack. Another false claim. But it had the effect of confounding and confusing what was going on with the napalm girl and the role of the United States in this photograph, in this attack. So why is it problematic to overstate the photo's significance? I argue that doing so is to indulge in mediacentrism, to attribute to the media far more influence and far more power than they really do exert, than they really do wield. Thoughts, comments? We can take a couple of questions about Napalm Girl. Sir?
Have you looked into the coverage at that time on the broadcast media?
Not so much. It's mostly the print coverage, which is frankly more readily accessible, but that's not necessarily a good justification.
What is in fact going on in this picture? The children are in distress, they're running, the American soldiers are moving in the same
They're not
direction.
American soldiers.
They appear to
They're
be
Vietnamese.
sort of ambling along. They don't
Yeah.
seem affected by what's going on.
Very good question. The centerpiece, of course, is a 9-year-old girl named Kim Phuc, who was part of a family. This is one of her brothers, another brother, who had sought shelter in their village and then were bombed mistakenly by the South Vietnamese Air Force plane. The people in the back, these are not American soldiers, these are South Vietnamese troops. This guy is a photographer. Back then, most correspondents and photographers, Western reporters and photographers, did wear something close to combat outfits and regalia, and the hat, the helmet as well. He is changing his film. He's reloading a Leica film camera, I believe, and they were very bulky, hard to reload, and if you didn't do it just right, rewind it just right, slowly enough, it jammed. So he's missing clearly the photograph of the year, and in a way, yes. So those are some of the and these two little children are also from the Tran Bang village as well, and they are fleeing this napalm attack. And Kim Phuc's clothing was burned away in the attack.
Burnt away, and she is not burnt.
She is burned. She is burned, severely burned on her back, neck, shoulders. And there's a video clip that was taken of this attack by ITN, the ITN network in Britain, and it shows a rear view in which there is severe burns on the back of her body. So they're fleeing, and the photograph that was entered into the Pulitzer Prize competition carried the title "The Terror of War." Over the years, it has become called Napalm Girl. She, Kim Phuc, now lives in Ontario, in Canada. She, let's see, the story is that she married another Vietnamese whom she met in Cuba. They went to Moscow for their honeymoon, and then on their way back to Cuba, the plane stopped in Gander, Newfoundland, where they took the spur of the moment decision to defect and sought out a Canadian customs official and defected. So she lives now in Canada. Final question on this one.
You provided the Gallup poll from 1971, 60% against the war of Americans. Did you look at post-photo Gallup polls to see if it was still about 60% or it changed?
It continued to climb. And Gallup has asked this question periodically, not every month, but periodically over the years. And I think in 1990 it got up to like 72% or 75%.
So if it continued to increase, I mean, potentially it was helped by this photo.
Right. They didn't ask this like in the immediate aftermath of the photograph. This photo has taken on far more significance in the years since it was taken than it had at the time, which is another interesting marker of media myths. Well, let's go back to 1938. Take a look at the radio dramatization of the War of the Worlds. Halloween Eve, 1938. Supposedly scared the bejesus out of the American public. Sent tens of thousands of people into the streets in panic, mass hysteria. Or so the story goes. The radio show that night was an adaptation of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, which came out in the late 1890s. The book was published in Britain in 1898. It was serialized in Cosmo in 1897. Here's the Cosmo, the June 1897 number. Cosmo. Looks a little different. Anyway, H.G. Wells, known for his early science fiction work. What was another one of his works? Time Machine, exactly. But War of the Worlds was one of his, and it was adapted by Orson Welles, no relation, on the Mercury Theater on the Air broadcast of October 30th, 1938. Orson Welles was a theatrical prodigy. He at the time was 23 years old and had been starring in and directing the Mercury Theater on the air broadcasts on CBS radio since the spring or summer of 1938. In just a couple of years, Wells goes on to his greatest work, his greatest masterpiece, Citizen Kane, 1941 motion picture, arguably the best motion picture ever made. And it tells the life, it's sort of adapted from the life and good times of William Randolph Hearst. It's loosely based on Hearst. But anyway, back to the War of the Worlds. It was aired, this dramatization was aired on Mercury Theater, which had a time slot, 8 to 9 p.m., a regular time slot on Sunday evenings on the CBS radio network. And that night, although estimates are very fuzzy and squishy, the best estimates were that perhaps 6 million people were listening to at least a portion, a substantial portion of the program that night. The show was done very cleverly, very imaginatively. It featured simulated news bulletins that broke into snoozy dance music. And Americans by 1938 had become acclimated to this technique of radio, breaking into regularly scheduled broadcasts to provide updates, to provide important breaking news, important information. This technique had been used effectively during the war scare of late summer and early fall 1938, when Hitler was making demands on the Sudetenland, a portion of Czechoslovakia. War seemed to be in the offing in Europe, and Americans were attuned to that, often through interrupted news bulletins that interrupted their show. So Wells and his merry band of the Mercury Theater adapts this technique very effectively, very well, injects urgency into an otherwise snoozy Sunday night program. The radio adaptation was set in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, not far from Princeton. Orson Welles is taking H.G. Wells's book, which was set in the UK, and adapts it to US locales. And the story, of course, of the War of the Worlds tells of the invasion of Earth by Martians wielding heat rays who begin to annihilate the human race as they march on New York City and other places in the country, and finally are taken down by the common cold, essentially. A spoiler break, a spoiler. Anyway, came out in 1898, so I'm sure most people would have known anyway. But if you're not, sorry. This was done on radio, and the most disturbing portions of Wells's broadcast that night came about 15 to 20 minutes into the show. By then, within 20 minutes, Martians had blasted off from their planet, traveled through interstellar space, or whatever, interplanetary space, landed on Earth, set up their heat rays, and began to wipe out any sign of human life, all within 20 minutes. Panic supposedly sweeps the country. People are set into the streets, out of their minds in fear that the Earth is ending, the world has come to a close, that Martians have invaded and are taking over the Earth. I mean, it sounds illogical. But that's what newspapers reported the next day. The New York Times, its front page. Radio listeners in panic, taking war drama as fact. The newspapers were claiming the country was seized that night by widespread panic, mass hysteria, that this radio fake had scared the country. Great story. And the newspapers played it as if it were true. These are excerpts from some of the newspapers, prominent newspapers of the time. A wave of mass hysteria seized thousands of radio listeners throughout the nation between 8:15 and 9:30 last night, the New York Times reported. The Washington Post said hysteria swept the nation for a long and fearful hour. Now, newspapers had no way that night to pin down and verify these sweeping claims. For one thing, it's a Sunday night, late at night. Newspaper newsrooms typically have, at best, skeletal crews. A handful of reporters, a handful of editors. Nowhere near enough to begin to verifying these sweeping claims that the country was gripped in panic and mass hysteria. And if you read closely what those reports said, they were taken and developed from a rather few number of scattered anecdotes of odd behavior that night. More important, if panic and mass hysteria had seized the country that night, if tens of thousands of Americans had been frightened out of their minds, headed for the hills or whatever, you would think that there would have been a number of deaths, serious injuries, property damage. All of this would have resulted from a spasm, a countrywide spasm of mass hysteria
How about on the radio
and
station?
panic. We'll get to that. You're so good today. You're ahead of me all the time here. There were no deaths, no serious injuries, no suicides associated, linked to the War of the Worlds dramatization that night. And had there been this kind of upheaval, this calamity, this panic, newspapers would have seized on it and reported about it for days afterwards. They would have reported on the consequences of this upheaval for many days. And yet, the story drops off the front page and out of the newspapers together within 2 or 3 days. Not only that, people checked, if they were concerned about what was going on, one of the first things they did was to check the newspaper listings. Voila, War of the Worlds, 8 p.m., CBS radio. It's in the paper. We know what's, going on. And if they were still concerned, they would have, yes ma'am, played with the dial. Back in 1938, there was a phenomenon called dialitis. People, like we do with the remotes today, are constantly twisting the dial to see if there's something better on. So they would have turned to other stations. They were acclimated to doing so. If the end of the earth is happening, it's not going to be broadcast exclusively on CBS. Other stations are going to have this news. So they're checking the evidence that's available to them, twisting the dial. And some people considered the program's internal evidence. What do you think I mean by that?
Were there commercials?
No, there were not. But what internal evidence might they have suggested?
There's no Grover's whatever.
There is Grover's Mill, New Jersey. It's a hamlet outside of Princeton. It's there, sir.
My father, who was 14 or 15 at the time this was broadcast, I asked him, was he panicked? And he said, they were switching from one location to another. Like, here we go to Grover's Mill, and they were there like that. And he said, that wasn't possible at the time, so he thought it was all fake.
That's right. Some of the internal evidence was that events were moving far too quickly.
Well, they announced several times during the broadcast that it was a dramatization.
They only did that after the first 45 minutes. The intro made clear it was a dramatization. Then the next disclaimer comes 45 minutes later. And then there's another one near the top of the hour. So for the bulk, they're not saying this is not true. But if you consider the internal evidence, no way. No way could this be happening. No way could the Martians have blasted off from their planet, traveled through interplanetary space, set up on Earth, wiped out the greeting party in Grover's Mill, and then moved on to New Jersey, from New Jersey into New York City, in a half an hour or so. I mean, it's just not possible. And you're right. Some of the internal movements were happening too quickly. They would go from Princeton to Grover's Mill in 10 minutes. 1938, very hard to do.
It also switches from the news report format to an internal monologue of one of the survivors who's hiding. So that's that switch in tone
and technique deep into the program, which is, I think, some of the most boring parts of the War of the Worlds. The best part is the first half hour. And besides, not only these factors, but scholarly literature on mass panic and hysteria say it's rare, it's very rare, and it quickly passes. It doesn't happen. So the notion that a whole country would be seized in this panic and hysteria because of a radio show just isn't logical. Just isn't logical. So why did the newspapers play it up that way? Why did they say there was such upheaval that night?
It's a good story.
It's a good story.
Good presentation.
They had wire service reports to go on. That's what many newspapers reporting on this hysteria relied upon. These newspaper reports, these wire service reports, were roundups that emphasized breadth, in other words, reports from across the country rather than in detail or in depth. As I said earlier, newspapers had no reliable way of confirming the sweeping claims they made in their newspapers on their front pages that day. Not only that, but newspapers in the late 1930s were seriously challenged by this new media called radio. Radio hadn't been invented in 1930. It was invented like in 1920. It was on the air commercially with KDKA and other stations in the early 1920s. And by 1938, radio has become an important rival source for news, entertainment, information, and advertising. An important rival source to the established medium newspapers. And the War of the Worlds represented for newspapers an irresistible opportunity to slam radio for being the immature, unreliable, irresponsible, not credible new medium that it was on occasion. It was this classic case of an old established legacy medium criticizing, rebuking, chastising the upstart rival, the upstart new medium. A phenomenon we've seen in recent years, have we not? Anyway, this overwhelmingly negative press commentary and editorializing about radio and how it had to grow up and become responsible helped to solidify this notion that panic and mass hysteria swept the United States that night. In the end, there is no compelling evidence that mass panic seized the country that night. There were reports of people, anecdotally, who were frightened by what they heard on Orson Welles' clever radio show that night. But these reports of fright and being disturbed by what they heard certainly did not rise to the level of nationwide panic or mass hysteria. You can be frightened by going to a horror movie and yet not be scared out of your mind that you're going to be running out of the theater saying, the earth is ending. So what? That's a great question that academics ought to ask themselves more often about their research. Okay, so what's important here? What's the significance? If they can't answer the so what question, then the corollary is, who cares and why bother? So what? So what does debunking myths tell us? Why does it matter? I argue that to debunk media myths is to align oneself with a fundamental objective of good journalism, that of getting it right, getting the story accurately. So this is not to bash the news media, but to align with their better instincts. It's also, the task of debunking is obviously to insist that on a demarcation between fact and fiction, and to assert that there is value, intrinsic value, in setting straight the historic record. And also, it's important to debunk myths because doing so helps place the news media in a more coherent and rational framework. It helps us better understand that media power tends to be modest, diffused, situational, and nuanced. Just because we live in a media-saturated environment doesn't mean that we are always acting on media messages. Sometimes we do, but typically it's diffused and very modest, the media effects. So what accounts for these media myths? We've talked about some of the reasons. There are at least three that really stand out for me. Media myths help to make history accessible, appealing, engaging. These are great stories, appealing stories. Two young, intrepid, hard-working reporters to the Washington Post bringing down a president, that's a great story. It makes Watergate far more accessible than to say, no, it was John Sirica, the judge, it was the Irvin Committee, it was the FBI, it were the special prosecutors. You know, people start going, okay, we're losing focus here. Media myths simplify history and make it accessible. And media centrism, the notion that the media are at the center of and are decisive forces and factors, is very reassuring to journalists, especially in this era in which news budgets are being slashed. Traditional news media are mere shells of what they used to be. It's a tough time for journalists, tough time to be journalists. And the notion that there was this time when reporters could bring down a president, that is reassuring. And also, these stories are too good not to be true.
They're fun.
That's right. They're engaging, they're entertaining. They shouldn't be false. Another reason why media myths live on and why they are so tenacious. Thank you for your courtesy and your attention, folks. I'd be happy.
Back on Watergate, related to the newspapers, I guess three questions. Why did the Post get more credit than the New York Times and the LA Times? Mightn't it have been competition among those three major papers, sort of circling around back on the out there that you just mentioned? And mightn't they collectively, not just the Post, but collectively, had some influence, maybe more influence than you're crediting the Post with, for keeping it alive and causing other people to investigate?
It was a local story. It was a Washington, D.C. story. And so it was a story that the Post could cover in multiple dimensions, whereas it was harder for the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times even to offer up that kind of coverage. I one time did a count of the number of stories that mentioned Watergate in the Washington Post, LA Times, and New York Times, excluding any real estate ads for the building there. And it's pretty clear that in the summer and early fall of 1972, the Post is mentioning Watergate more often than the other two newspapers. But it's not like they're alone. It's not like they're alone. Plus, the reporters themselves, Woodward and Bernstein, had the great idea of writing a book about themselves. And the book was written in sort of late 1972, early 73. So they kind of let things slide a little bit, and which allowed an opening for Seymour Hersh, who was an aggressive investigative reporter for the New York Times, to step in and take some of the big stories. He broke the cover up. He broke the hush money payments the Washington Post didn't do. So, but Woodward and Bernstein had their book, and they wrote it with a movie in mind. Redford bought the movie rights to the book well before the book was even done. And so they had this sort of multimedia extravaganza in mind, and that's what helped seal their relationship to Watergate.
In the book that every day they checked the New York Times first thing in the morning. It was the first thing they did to see what story the Times was pursuing.
Right, but I think that's a natural, instinctive, reflexive reaction for journalists of that time, just to see what the Times was reporting for their own protective purposes. But those are a couple of reasons why Woodward and Bernstein sort of are recognized as a centerpiece of having uncovered the Watergate scandal when they really were marginal players at best. You had a question, sir?
How long after an event, that is months, years, decades, I'm just wondering, based on what you've seen being in the industry, how long would you recommend in order to really have the truth?
It does vary. It's hard to offer a hard and fast rule on this. I think it's safe to say that on major breaking stories, those initial reports must be treated with a lot of skepticism, and because they're almost inevitably going to be true. That is one thing that you can almost certainly predict. Think of 9/11 and how many other elements of misreporting there were. I mean, the State Department, there was supposedly a car bomb went off in the State Department. Another hijacked plane was headed for Camp David. I mean, these were stories that were reported and proved not to be true. So I think it's important to be skeptical and to wait a little bit, at least, for the first reports to shake out before they're, before they are vetted thoroughly.
When you say a little while, what would you recommend?
I think it's at least 24 hours for a major breaking news story.
I mean,
But Hurricane Katrina, that was like at least 3 days, and even longer. I mean, the reports of mayhem and violence and pillaging, and the Superdome was just, overrun with gangs and, robbing and killing and raping people. I mean, it's not true. None of that was true.
What's your take on the Kitty Genovese case? Oh, that's a great one, and you could almost argue that it's largely fabrication, not just.
Yeah, the notion, the Kitty Genovese case is how many? 50 years ago?
Yeah.
I think there was a book that came out last summer
That was Kevin Cook.
at the 50th anniversary, and it's about a case in New York City in which a young woman coming home late at night was stabbed to death, and there were like 36 or 39 bystanders, witnesses who ignored her cries for help. And it became emblematic of the larger urban jungle story that, that New York City is an inhospitable place where people won't help out their neighbors and so forth. The myth was a minor one, I believe. I think it more revolves around how many witnesses there were rather than the fact that people ignored her cries for help. And my best understanding of this story, because I did look at it as a potential candidate for maybe a sequel or something of getting it wrong, that the dispute may rest with the number of people, the number of witnesses, that the New York Times exaggerated the number.
I think by pretty wildly.
There may not have been 39 or 36. Right, but there were people who heard her screams and did nothing.
They did summon the police, and the police didn't find anything initially.
That's right. So there's some element of truth to this story of not responding to cries of help late at night, but it wasn't like the huge number that the Times reported in the, I believe it was the 60s, the mid-60s. It's a complicated case. It really is. Go ahead.
What do you perceive as some of the more contemporary media myths? You mentioned Katrina. What other one? Newtown. What are some of the other ones that you would put in that category? Maybe not to the depth of those, but
one of the ones that's in the book it goes back 12 years to the Washington Post's reporting about Jessica Lynch. She was a 19-year-old Army private first class who was in a support unit, a maintenance company. It was really at the very tail end of this long convoy of U.S. forces entering Iraq from Kuwait in 2003. And her unit, this maintenance company, made a wrong turn in the city, southern city of Nasiriyah in Iraq, and was soon under an ambush. And this was a unit of clerks and cooks and people who never expected to see frontline combat, yet here suddenly they are. And the Washington Post, well, Jessica Lynch was injured, taken prisoner, and hospitalized in Nasiriyah by the Iraqis, and 8 or 10 or 11 other Americans were killed in this ambush. And it was a devastating early encounter in the Iraq War of 2003. She was rescued by a unit of special forces, U.S. Special Forces, who evacuated her from the hospital successfully on the 1st of April 2003. And it was the first successful rescue of a U.S. POW from behind enemy lines since World War II. 2 days later, the Washington Post reports that Jessica Lynch fought heroically in this ambush in Nasiriyah. Essentially, she was like a female Rambo, mowing down the attacking Iraqis despite being shot and stabbed herself and seeing her comrades falling all around her. This is what the Post reported on its front page, April 3, 2003. And it had the cinematic quality to it, and it was thinly sourced to U.S. officials, whom the Post won't identify to this day. We do know that they were not Pentagon officials because one of the people who shared a byline on this story, Vernon Loeb, said that, and he was the Pentagon correspondent for the Post, he said, I could never get the Pentagon to talk about Jessica Lynch. I had indications that they may have heard these reports, but they wouldn't say anything about Jessica Lynch. Yet the story has blown up over the years that it was the military that concocted this story, somehow fed it to the Washington Post, which put it on its front page as a way of trying to boost morale for the war effort. That's the myth. Jessica Lynch was no hero, as she herself will say, and there was no ambush in which she was attacking or fighting off attacking Iraqis with her
M4.
Thank you. And her gun jammed in the attack. She never fired a shot. She was severely injured, not by Iraqis, but by the crash of her Humvee after it was hit by an RPG, and it crashed into a disabled truck in Nasiriyah. So that story about Jessica Lynch's heroics in the Washington Post became an international sensation. News organizations around the world picked up on this story. A 19-year-old waif-like blonde woman, firing at Iraqis. That's a great story. Not true, but it was a great story. It was quickly sort of, some of the layers were peeled back and quickly found to be not true, but the Post stuck with that story for a long time. And it had the effect of catapulting Jessica Lynch into international recognition and renown that hasn't fully receded to this day.
You've got these cases here that clearly got misreported. Have you also looked at near misses, ones that look like they might join this pantheon, but somehow got pulled back to reality, to sort of compare and contrast how journalists can learn from this in a general way?
That's a great question, and let me just answer it in a slightly different fashion. A near miss, does it sound like a myth, but under inspection proves not to be the case? And you hate to lose them like that, but it does happen. Do you remember? You probably are familiar with the 1884 presidential campaign slogan, "Ma, Ma, where's Pa?" Gone to the White House. Very good. That just sounded like a quote that was too neat and tidy and too convenient. Do they really say that? So I started poking around one afternoon in a database of historical newspapers, which is available through American University's on-site library site, and damn, I couldn't find anything during that campaign in which that was used. No, that slogan or anything close to it. I said, man, I'm onto something here. This is good. This will really break this one wide open. And then I continued the search, and there was at the end of the campaign sort of a look back, and one of the newspaper stories cited that slogan as having been used often during campaign rallies to talk about it was Grover Cleveland and his illegitimate child, and the Republicans were trying to make a big deal out of that in 1884, and so I thought the slogan was sort of made up years later, but it proved not to be the case. Another good one is the famous photograph by Robert Capa showing the guy during the Spanish Civil War at the moment of his death. He's sort of rocking back, and the moment the bullet strikes him. And there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points the other way, that this photograph was not taken where Capa supposedly said it was taken, and there's just a lot, but nothing completely persuasive that says, yeah, this is a lock. This is definitely a media myth debunked. So there have been cases out there where, yeah, I've been disappointed. Thank you, Mr. Mack. Thank you all. Thank you very much.